Welcome, everyone. I am so glad you decided to get off the tractor and to get out of your truck and to come into the office, or I know some of you are out there on your smartphone or not so smartphone, and you're listening to this. We'll try to keep it informative and tight. Let's cover a few housekeeping items to begin with. At the bottom of your audience console, there are multiple application icons for your use during the program. If you have any questions during the webcast, submit those using the question box. We will try to answer your questions during the webcast, but if more information is needed, we will run out, and we will run out of time. We'll answer it later in an email. A PDF of the presentation is available in the resources folder. This program has been approved for legal education hours. To report your hours, click on the CEU icon at the bottom of the screen. A certificate of attendance, including course numbers, will be emailed to you tomorrow. Participants may also download the certificate at the completion of today's program, which may be used in other industries wanting to report this for continuing education or professional development credit. Toward the end of the program, be sure to complete our short survey. Our host will use the feedback to plan future programs. That's all for housekeeping. Let's get started with our program. I'm Stephen Gambrell with the Mississippi Valley Flood Control Association. For the past several decades, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has been shifting programs from investing in flood control to managing flood risk, and along the way, broadening its levee safety program through development and issuance of versions of pamphlets and guidance documents. The Army Corps is allegedly consolidating that guidance into a Levee Safety Engineer Circular, or EC. It's released in draft form. It's available for public comment through July the 27th. A review of the proposed EC reveals that the Army Corps has gone beyond already issued guidance and seeks to impose new requirements or obligations onto the local sponsors. In this webinar, we will learn about the substance and practical implications of the proposed EC from the non-federal perspectives of seasoned policy advisors, water resource attorneys, and a local sponsor. The hour-long presentation will be followed by a moderated 30-minute Q&A with the non-federal participants. Let's talk quickly in an overview. A few of the things our presenters will refer to and discuss. They will discuss the EC, the Engineer Circular on the Levee Safety Program by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. They will talk about new non-federal requirements or obligations, non-federal perspectives, and looking beyond how this proposal might work. They'll also look at some other essential questions: the who, the what, the when, the where, and most importantly, the why. After the presentations, we will have a moderated Q&A with the non-federal participants. Let me do a few general introductions of our presenters today. I'm Stephen Gambrell, the Executive Vice President of the Mississippi Valley Flood Control Association. Our chairman, Mr. Riddle Minsky, he currently serves also as the president of the 5th Louisiana Levee District. He sent in his short statement, and he says, over many decades, we, the local sponsor, the local partners, have been able to work with our Congress and the Corps to protect people and their land. We look forward to making sure that we continue to help the Congress deliver the laws and appropriations for flood control that make our land and our people so productive. Our topics: WRDA and the National Flood Insurance Program by Mr. Kyle Gilster with Husch Blackwell from Washington, D.C. Policy Perspective on Levee Safety by Mr. Dan Delich from Floodplain Alliance for Insurance Reform. Legal Considerations by Ms. Corinne Jacoby, Husch Blackwell partner, and Mississippi Valley Flood Control Association Engineering Committee Chair. We'll hear about local concerns from Mr. Paul Woodward, Papio Missouri River Natural Resources District out of Omaha, Nebraska. And then we'll moderate some comment and QA sessions at the end. Emily, unless I've missed something, let's get started with our first presenter. He'll be Kyle Gilster. He grew up in Nebraska. He's the son of an agriculture professor. He attended the University of Nebraska, after which he began his legal career on the staff at the Nebraska Attorney General's office. He served as a legislative aide, as a legislative assistant, and legal counsel working on the 2004 NFIP reform. Kyle manages Husch Blackwell's DC office and its public policy, regulatory, and government affairs practice group. Kyle, welcome.
Hey, good morning, everybody. I hope everybody can hear me okay. And first of all, I hope everybody is safe and well. Thanks, Stephen, for the introduction. What I'm going to do today is to kind of set the stage from DC to kind of, where things are at. I'll talk about NFIP. I'll talk about WRDA. But before I do that, I wanted to talk about, the House, Senate, and the president. Obviously, it is an election year. Elections have big consequences. Want to focus in particular on the Senate. As you may know, right now, the Republicans control the Senate at a 53-47 margin. There are 4 seats in particular that are considered top seats currently held by Republicans, being Arizona, Colorado, Carolina, and Maine. Those seats are very much in play. You also have an Alabama seat, which is currently held by a Democrat, which could potentially flip back. The reason I say that is, there's the possibility that, the Senate could flip. And with that being said, clearly that has policy reasons. There's a possibility that the Senate stays Republican. Forecasts predict it will continue to stay Democrat, and I have no presidency, so we'll leave it at that. So, wanted to talk first of all about the next program, and this is something near and dear to me. I worked on the Bunning B. Ryder Blumenauer Flood Act 2004. I worked for Congressman B. Ryder and Chairman Oxley at that point. Want to talk briefly as we move to the next slide on the National Flood Insurance Fascinating program created in Congress in 1968. What's interesting is when it was created, actually was the end of some of the great society, and actually was one of the things that LBJ ultimately signed into law. It's part of the Department of Homeland Security through FEMA. It was last in what was called the Bigger Waters Bill, signed into law by President Obama. Interestingly, one thing that has always plagued the National Flood Insurance Program is how to treat properties that are higher for flooding. And the Bigger Waters attempted to do that, particularly as it relates to what are called pre-firm properties. Properties that are in the flood insurance program that were done before there were any maps, and they were effectively grandfathered into a lower rate. The Bigger Waters Bill made an attempt to put a lot of resources in mapping, which then resulted in higher flood insurance rates for consumers. Some of that got scaled back in the Grim Waters Bill in 2014. But the number one thing to remember on the National Flood Insurance Program is ultimately it's all about rates, and the rates that consumers are paying. And I can tell you, having worked up on the Hill, constituents are not shy about their concerns as it relates to rates. The last 5-year reauthorization bill ended on September 30th, 2017. Since that point, they've been doing kind of subsequent short-term extensions. We can move to the next slide. As part of that, the flood insurance program is now set to expire on September 30th, 2020. It got tag teamed actually with for the government. I fully expect it will get extended again. And again, we're now 3 years in extensions. One thing that's fascinating about flood insurance is not a partisan issue. It's a lot like WRDA. It's not a partisan issue. It's a bipartisan issue. It is a regional issue. It's a little bit like the Farm Bill in that regard. So you have interesting bedfellows on this. You have folks that often who don't often work together on this, but they do work together as it relates to flood insurance. Moving on to the next slide. In terms of where we're at in the 116th Congress to reauthorize, the House Financial Services, my old committee, did pass a 5-year reauthorization bill. That bill has not yet been acted on the House floor. Some of the things that committee bill did was the concept of providing vouchers, particularly for low and moderate income individuals, to help mitigate that cost, particularly in firm properties of higher rates for flood insurance, more money for mapping, and also heavy emphasis on building resiliency and mitigation. There is some cost to that bill. And up until now, that has been the main hurdle from it getting onto the House floor. There is some effort to try to make the NFIP program 100% solvent. That is a challenging thing to do without increasing rates. So at this point, that bill is still stuck in committee. On the Senate side, the Senate Banking Committee has not yet acted on their bill. Or any bill for that matter. The Senate Banking Committee under Chairman Crapo and Sherry Brown, the ranking member, have just kind of been in a wait and see mode, trying behind the scenes to get consensus. There is a bill by Senator Menendez that has a strong number of co-sponsors, S2187, wanted to flag that bill. Senator Menendez has been a leader as it relates to what happened in Hurricane Sandy in the Northeast. He's been able to unite also many members of the South who've also been obviously subject to many hurricanes and increased flood insurance payments there. So we will see what happens. Bottom line is I don't expect, I would be surprised this year if any long-term flood insurance bill gets through Congress. One thing, though, to very much bear in mind is our hurricane season and tropical storm season has already been fairly significant. We haven't had a big hit, thankfully, but if you would, clearly that helps motivate reauthorization and reform of the flood insurance program whenever you have a strong hurricane season. Candidly, it would also be something hard for Congress to wrestle with because clearly they're having to do stimuluses related to COVID-19. If you would have to add on stimuluses and flood insurance reform because of hurricanes, it would be even more daunting. If we can move on to the next slide. WRDA. Water Resources Development Act. I'm not really going to get too much into the weeds on this, but want to start very broadly. The Development Act is the statutory legislation which effectively authorizes the Corps of Engineers to conduct its activities on the civil side. 80% of the trade goods in the country are moved through our inland waterways and other harbors, et cetera. That's a sizable amount. WRDA is always something very important to members of Congress because of the water infrastructure projects. Some good news here. Senate, the committees of jurisdiction have each passed their bill. Let me House bill first, H.R. 7575, hot off the press. Last week, my committee, WRDA reauthorization bill by voice vote. What's nice, what Congress is doing right now is they've been passing WRDA bills on 2-year reauthorization increments. They started that in 2014, 2016, 2018, and now we're doing it in 2020. When I was on the Hill, the increments were further apart. I think that is important, in my view, to help create some accountability for the Corps of Engineers. And the members obviously want that accountability to help projects on. I am told that I believe the House floor may take up the WRDA bill as soon as next week. So that is something to watch. I expect it to be very bipartisan as well. You know, a couple things just to highlight in the House WRDA bill. They're really trying to get the backlog of feasibility studies through, as well as trying to get the water infrastructure projects to completion. One thing they also do is they're also deauthorizing a large number of projects, core projects that haven't happened. So as part of that, they're able to make the bill budget neutral, which I think is significant. Lastly, there is $10 billion, what is in the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund. There's a balance of that. The bill authorizes the ability to appropriate that money for certain harbor-related infrastructure projects. To the Senate bill, America's Water Infrastructure Act, that passed the EPW Committee, Environment and Public Works Committee, on May 6th, again by a very bipartisan consensus with Barrasso and Carper and Cardin and Shelley Moore Capital all strongly in support. Couple highlights from the Senate bill. They're trying to get all the feasibility studies through the Corps over the next 2-year time span, and they also authorize $17 billion of projects for the Corps. Bottom line, if there's one takeaway from today, from my part of the project, as it relates to both WRDA and NFIP, I expect them both, they're both bipartisan. I do expect WRDA potentially to get done later in the year, even though it's an election year, potentially in a lame duck, because it is so bipartisan. And with that, I will circle back to Stephen and happy to answer any questions.
Kyle, super job. Always efficient and informative. Thanks for what you do every day. We appreciate you very much. Kyle may not be able to stay for the full Q&A period, so if there are any questions that come up for Kyle, ask those, post those during the next presenter, and we will make sure we try to address those before Kyle leaves. I do have the privilege of introducing, I hope you can see my coffee cup, Dan, Dan Delich. Man, that's great coffee. Dan established the Floodplain Alliance for Insurance Reform in 2009 to advocate for economic flood damage reduction policy. FAIR is a nonprofit, nonpartisan coalition organized to generate flood policy analysis and perform outreach at the federal level. Dan began as a policy analyst in Washington, D.C. with the EPA and has 30 years of experience. He served as staff member of the U.S. Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works, advising on water resources development, climate change, and federal budget issues. Dan holds a BA in political science from Arizona State University in Tempe and resides in Plano, Texas. Ladies and gentlemen, Dan Delich.
Hey, Stephen, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
Good stuff. I appreciate it. Emily, if we could jump slides, please, to the overview. Just a quick look at that. I will try to categorize everything in those 4 or 5 areas. Next slide, please, Emily. So thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Appreciate that introduction, Stephen. Let's dive right into the EC. What does it say? This group of 5 slides, this one plus the next 4, include 14 or 15, depending on how you count, of the more than 30 instances where it is at minimum suggested, strongly suggested, that local sponsors are to be assigned new residual risk mitigation duties in landside areas across the broad floodplain. This particular citation is taken from Volume 3, which is the guidance for the Corps to support, quote, risk-informed federal investments, which superficially none of us would oppose, right? To support risk-informed investments or decision-making is to support efforts involving hazard, performance, and consequences, which to some of us sounds a lot like broad flood risk management. And indeed, the continuation of the sentence would seem to confirm that. Next slide, please. This item is taken from Volume 2, Levee Sponsor Activities, which, quote, describes activities necessary for effective flood risk management in communities where levees are part of the landscape, end quote. Quick note here, and I think our colleague, Paul Woodward, local sponsor from the Omaha area, who's going to follow me, will discuss this further. Section 1.2b, like boy, on page 2.1 informs the following, quote, nothing in this document modifies or takes the place of the responsibilities of levee sponsors identified in 33 CFR 208.10 or partnership agreements, which tells us that everything in the EC is additive or new. This would not seem to be a simple consolidation of policies. Next slide, please. These next two slides are going to be a challenge, forgive me, but let me give them a go. This too was taken from Volume 2, which speaks to local sponsors. This is Table 2.5.1. It summarizes activities that project sponsors can take to reduce risk and improve levee performance. Additionally, the table includes how levee sponsors can support others to reduce the consequences of flooding, including, just picking out a few here, implement planned mitigation actions, support broader community mitigation action implementation, develop, confirm planned mitigation actions, communicate, schedule, progress, and intent of planned mitigation action. Next slide, please. This is the worst of the pack. We're almost done with these busy screen captures. This one's busy. This is a continuation of that same table from Volume 2, Table 2.5.1. And I'd note the following. Levee sponsors are to monitor progress of short and long-term mitigation actions, document when work is completed, share progress reports with other levee sponsors and the broader community, determine what else could be done to further reduce risks, and help the broader community implement their mitigation actions, end quote. Next slide, please. Here's the final new duties screen capture. It is also found in the project sponsors Volume 2. I needed to show this to try to be fair. We had been told that the Corps is sensitive to the impediments, the challenges associated with imposing residual risk mitigation duties onto most local sponsors. And indeed, the EC reads on page 238 that, quote, and it's underlined in green, levee sponsors may not have the ability to implement some of these actions. So it may be necessary to work with other entities and communicate risks so that the responsible parties can make informed decisions and take action accordingly, end quote. If this statement truly rules the roost, then this draft EC requires substantial revisions to make clear, much clearer than at present, that mitigation actions beyond the reach of project sponsors shall not be imposed on said sponsors. Next slide, please. Why do we care about these things? Why do they matter? Because most local sponsors, notwithstanding their outsized contribution to improve life safety, flood damage reduction, navigation, and economic development in lowland areas, are not sovereign over the levee protected area. While local sponsors are understandably obligated to help build public awareness of the residual risk that exists near projects, most possess neither the resources nor the legal authority to administer prudent use and management of property that lies behind these projects. Every dollar in man-hour spent on residual risk mitigation in the floodplain is a dollar in man-hour not spent on their primary objective, levee sponsors, preventing catastrophic project failure. Expanded local sponsor duties increase legal exposure for potential loss of life and flood damages in connection both with the project and with the new mitigation duties around the floodplain. Corinne Jacoby, who's going to follow me, is going to go into that in some length. The diversion of time, talent, and attention, resources, would seem to be ordered here without any analysis that I'm aware of that rigorously assesses the net gains or net losses, the costs and the risks associated with this move to retask local sponsor personnel. While local sponsors are understandably obligated to help build public awareness of the residual risk, again, we possess neither the resources nor legal authority to administer many of these actions. In the face of dynamic flood risk attributable to a number of factors, our growing infrastructure gap, shifting demographics, development, and climatic forces, this proposal would have us divert our attention from vital infrastructure by retasking flood project managers with remote, diffuse floodplain management duties. Who is left minding the levee store? This is, in our opinion, a bad approach at the worst possible time. Next slide, please, Emily. Okay, in the remaining 4 or 5 minutes I have here, PL 99, the rehab program. Shown here is a recent one-pager issued by the agency and available on the program, Levee Safety Program's homepage. I have blown up the blue box there with some optimism. You may be able to read it. It shows proposed eligibility criteria changes, which are not spoken to in the EC directly. However, if you see that last item there, item number 4 that I've highlighted in yellow, it's clear, according to the Core Zone one-pager, that there is explicit linkage between PL 99 and the Levee Safety Program. There are changes proposed. New eligibility criteria include core assessments of local sponsor sharing and participating. Back in February of 2015, many of you will remember, many of you commented, the Corps issued and announced notice of proposed rulemaking, an ANPR. It has been stalled since the comment period closed in March of that year within the executive branch. We maintain that there is no clear direction from Congress to change the eligibility criteria. This is a program that has worked. It has extended and strengthened the infrastructure component to manage catastrophic flooding. It has facilitated highly desired local sponsor behavior and maintained federal involvement. Financially, yes, but also on continuously maintained infrastructure systems. This program is not structured or conceived to enhance zoning, or building codes, or most other flood risk management objectives, worthy though they are. This is an incentive-based concept to lessen flooding and prevent catastrophic project failure. It isn't at all clear to us that the benefits of changing eligibility criteria, a very active idea, would exceed the costs and benefits of leaving as is. Where is the Corps analysis demonstrating the need for changed criteria? If it's simply a matter of outlays, I would offer two observations. One, first consider the 9-to-1 National Flood Risk Management Program return on investment. The 95-to-1 Mississippi River and Tributaries Project return on investment. And just last year, fiscal year 19, the Corps estimated recently a $348 billion NED benefit estimate. Second observation, if needed, why not propose a reasonable cost share adjustment instead of this convoluted proposal? We will not support changing the eligibility for PL 99 to require the sponsors to pursue this subjective mitigation measures being foisted by the Levee Safety Program and the EC. Next slide, please. Core risk assessments, flying by quickly. Safe levees require identification of engineering and maintenance deficiencies accompanied by viable infrastructure remedies. In March of 2018, the Corps put out a very well done report. I compliment it at every opportunity for the information packed into it and its appearance. On page 28 of said report, however, the Corps, in talking about screening assessments, LSACs, I believe, made the following short statement. There may be reluctance to share risk information with the public when an immediate and viable risk management solution has not been identified. That's unacceptable. Safe levees require identification of engineering and maintenance deficiencies and viable infrastructure remedies. Risk assessments may well indeed offer improved risk awareness, communication, and other advisory benefits. Again, here, there is no clear direction from Congress to use these for regulatory purposes. Next slide, and I'll wrap it up here. Just a quick word about process. It does matter. Economic analysis, applying established science, ensuring public participation and transparency, and of course, federalism. Clear principles and well-conceived administrative process underlies good government. We all agree with that. The Bill of Rights for the Governed is what the late, great Senator McCarran, a Democrat from Nevada, once said about the APA. And scarcity is a real thing. We can all agree on that too. we can never satisfy everyone. Will a policy, program, or project save us more than it will cost us? Which alternative will yield the greatest benefit for the cost? These ideas and efforts to do something about them have been bipartisanly pursued. Each of the presidents shown on that slide, both parties, and many of their predecessors have issued executive orders, signed bills into law to reform and improve the regulatory and project review process. Next slide, please. These principles posted here, these requirements, indeed, these burdens on the government seem relevant to us. I've captured here the Levee Safety Program's one-pager, where we're told, and for those of us who have read it, we certainly know that although engineer circulars are typically used to establish internal agency policy, this document, the EC, has been drafted to be applicable both to the Corps and to levee sponsors. So I submit that these and other requirements, including an EO issued last October by the President regarding agency guidance, along with the APA, along with the Information Quality Act, along with these various and sundry executive orders, seem applicable and necessary. Final slide. We have benefited from a century of partnering to maintain flooding. Partnership is centered on reliable infrastructure. PL 99 has extended and strengthened the partnership. Today, we seem to diminish the value of economic planning and investment. Many are fearful about a changing climate. Demographic and development patterns increase our exposure. Gilbert White taught us that multiple means are needed to successfully manage flood consequences. Our best options to achieve that will not involve diverting the scarce resources and immense talent of local project sponsors. Thank you very much.
Dan, super job. Thanks. Thanks for that. We have several questions submitted. Thanks for submitting those questions. Kyle has answered one or two. Kyle, would you take a few of those questions and run through those before we go on to the next presenter?
Yeah, I'd be happy to, Stephen. You know, one of the questions that we had dealt with, WRDA, and what is the underlying initial statute called the Water Resources Development Act. Every 2 years, Congress likes WRDA something different. So here, renamed it America's Water Infrastructure Act of 2020. That's still a real. Just think about WRDA was like the initial act, and then every 2 year marketing, which I just answered, which fascinating question, which with for over 25 years is one insurance product that covers hurricanes, floods, etc. Trying to get Congress, the states, because a lot of states like California have their own earthquake authority, an insurance market on the same page has been highly challenging. So those are a couple questions.
Yeah, thank you, Kyle.
Turn it back to you, Stephen.
Yep, appreciate it very much. And those questions are live. You can ask them, and we'll answer them live, and some of them with voice answer. The rest will be answered on email. Our next presenter is Corinne Jacoby. Corinne has spent more than 25 years working on all aspects of levees and flood protection, including 14 years as a local sponsor providing oversight and direction for $600 million in new projects, working alongside the Corps and FEMA. Earlier in her career, she led design of projects in Illinois and Missouri. She's a professional engineer. But as an attorney, Corinne combines experience with legal knowledge to help clients, partners, and sponsors overcome the hurdles they face working along the waterways or building and operating flood protection projects. She is active in nonprofits for water resources associations, the University of Missouri, and serves as chair of the Mississippi Valley Flood Control Association Engineering Committee. Corinne, we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Stephen. Can you hear me okay?
Perfectly.
Okay, great. Well, let's get started. So, moving from a policy perspective, I'm going to speak to several legal considerations shown here on this slide. And the next slide, please. So to begin, is this EC a rule? And if so, is it a substantive or interpretive rule? Substantive rules represent the agency carrying out the express will of Congress or are to be used when there is an effect on the individual's rights or obligations. Those substantive rules are also referred to as legislative rules because they carry the force and effect of law. Next slide, please. So, in contrast, an interpretive rule advises the public of the agency's construction of the statutes and rules which it administers. It does not have that same force and effect as a substantive rule of same force of law and effect as a substantive rule. And even if an interpretive rule has the procedural dressing of a binding requirement, such as notice and comment period, the agency cannot impose new obligations or assert that the rule has the force and effect of law without recognizing it as a regulation subject to the requirements of the APA. So what is the EC? It is likely a non-binding interpretive rule. So moving on, imposing the new obligations. When an agency intends to impose new obligations through policy, they must publish it in the Federal Register as a regulation, and it is subject to the procedural requirements of the APA. Beyond simply having a notice and comment period, the APA requires reference to the legal authority under which the rule is proposed, and that is something that the Levee Safety EC proposal fails to clearly identify. So, in summary, new obligations are imposed through substantive, not interpretive rules. And this is likely a non-binding interpretive rule. Next slide, please. Next, I'd like to talk about challenging a risk assessment. So, what can you do when you don't agree with the risk assessment result? Unlike the appeal process, the Corps set forth in guidance for the PL 8499 program for challenging determinations of eligibility, the EC does not establish a means by which a non-federal sponsor can challenge the results of a risk assessment. And you see here on this slide a snippet from the Corps engineering pamphlet for PL 8499, which also references the engineering regulation. Next slide, please. That engineering regulation, the relevant portion is shown here. Note that just as intended with risk assessments, non-federal sponsors are encouraged and often do participate in inspections of their levees. and the results of those inspections, which have real implications, including rehab program eligibility, are essentially beyond their control. Hence, it is appropriate that the Corps provide process and procedure for challenging an unacceptable condition rating given by USACE. What is confusing is why a similar process is not provided for the results of risk assessments. Next slide, please. Because risk assessments are primarily authorized by Congress for raising risk awareness and not as program criteria, there is not statutory language that provides for review of a risk assessment. Final agency action is reviewable under the Administrative Procedure Act. In order to meet the finality requirement, two elements must be satisfied. First, the conclusion of the process or last word on the subject. And second, the element is met when the agency action imposes an obligation, denies a right, or fixes some legal relationship. It would be through having a final agency action that a non-federal sponsor could seek judicial review. But the Corps, characterizing the non-federal sponsor as a participant in the risk assessment process, coupled with the lack of any appeal process, does not bring about a final agency action. So in conclusion, while there may be some action or activity by the Corps that does so, and perhaps that's a determination of PL 8499 ineligibility, it would likely be only after the consequences of the risk assessment were felt that a challenge to a risk assessment could be pursued. Next slide, please. Another issue raised by several levee sponsors is growing liability exposure. When Congress passed the 1928 Flood Control Act, it established broad immunity for the Corps. And courts have held that grant of immunity for any potential damages, including loss of life, applies broadly to management of flood control projects. Perhaps that will extend to management of levee risk, which the Corps has identified as the risk that exists due to the presence of the levee system. It's important that local sponsors are not similarly shielded, and that the Corps bears none of that liability exposure. Under the second bullet on this slide, 33 USC 3304. Local owner-operators can be held liable for the loss of life or property in cases where operation and maintenance of their project is found to be in violation of applicable standards or requirements. Next slide, please. As new obligations are generated and existing ones expanded, the potential exposure for local owner-operators increases. Moreover, it is of concern that as the Corps calls upon levee sponsors to take on new mitigation activities, they are not doing so through regulation, which compels the levee sponsor to act. This levee safety proposal leaves levee sponsors in the quandary of whether to adhere to the Corps' EC and to take on that potential increase in liability exposure, or not comply with the levee safety proposal and risk the consequences of the risk assessment result or Corps action. Next slide, please. Finally, I would like to talk about changing the deal and how this proposal changes that deal made between local sponsors and the Corps. So many of you are familiar with what are sometimes referred to as the ABC assurances. And those must be provided by a local sponsor of a federal flood control project prior to the Corps beginning construction. I'd like to draw your attention to item C, which addresses regulations prescribed by the Secretary and commits to maintaining and operating the works in accordance with those. Next slide, please. While some believe the adherence to prescribed regulations may be broadly interpreted to include a variety of requirements, the federal regulations serve to limit that by stating that those are as codified at 33 CFR 20810, which I'm sure many on this call are familiar with. Those are federal flood control regulations for operation and maintenance of a project. Next slide, please. If the levee safety EC cannot be required of local sponsors as a prescribed regulation for which they provided assurances, then one must wonder under what authority the Corps seeks to implement this proposal. The authority granted the Corps from Congress related to risk assessments appears primarily focused on raising risk awareness and not to programmatically administer mitigation activities in levee protected areas through the creation of new obligations. Next slide, please. So PL 8499 is a discretionary program. And, you know, we've touched on it a little bit, and I'd like to speak to, can more be required under PL 8499 than what we currently have? As mentioned, it's a discretionary program carried out by the Corps as the rehabilitation and inspection program. And that's done in accordance with the federal regulations 33 CFR 203. And again, as a reminder, although agencies may clarify existing obligations through non-binding guidance exempt from APA notice and comment requirements, agencies are not to use that authority to inappropriately attempt to regulate without following rulemaking procedures of the APA. Next slide, please. So the current regulation, 33 CFR 203, describes an inspection-based program that requires an, quote, active status determination to qualify for rehabilitation assistance. Changes to that program can be made through APA rulemaking, which the Corps initiated with an advance notice of public rulemaking in 2015, but that remains stalled within the executive branch. As mentioned earlier, the Corps has recently indicated new proposed eligibility criteria, wherein they would continue to include operation maintenance and inspections and disaster preparedness, or I think reframed as emergency preparedness, and to which they will add sharing information and most notably participation in levee safety program activities. Next slide, please. So some final thoughts as we wrap up on legal considerations that you might wish to take away from this segment. And I know it was a lot of words on the slide, and I apologize for not including any pictures, but I hope that those words paint a picture for you. The levee safety EC is likely a non-binding interpretive rule. Imposing new obligations on levee sponsors requires publishing as a regulation in the Federal Register and agency adherence to the Administrative Procedure Act. Not providing a means by which a levee sponsor can appeal the result of that assessment unreasonably denies them a final agency action and access to judicial review. It's important to retain an appeal process for PL 8499 eligibility determinations and to also have one for risk assessments. Under the levee safety EC, levee sponsors are faced with increased liability exposure, or else the consequences imposed by the Corps for their not having complied. And we don't yet know for certain what those are, but indications are that they may be PL 8499 eligibility. The Flood Control Acts and federal regulations provide the terms of the deal for flood control projects, which the Corps is seeking to change without APA rulemaking, that identifies relevant authority and protects rights and interests of regulated entities. While the Levee Safety EC itself is not a substantive rule, by incorporation into the new PL 8499 rule, some of its requirements could attain the force and effect of law. And lastly, it's important to remember that federal regulations, while not law, have the force of law as they are promulgated under statutory authority. And not only do they set forth how the agency will enforce the legislative acts passed by Congress and are treated by the courts as legally binding, they can also provide protections for regulated entities. And I hope that you've seen in the regulations referenced here some of those protections. Thank you very much, Stephen. That's all I have.
Thanks, Corinne. I appreciate that very much. Kyle has answered all his questions on the Q&A box that is out there so far. Dan and Corinne, if you would look at the some of the questions and post some answers, then we'll go through after Paul and talk about some of those. Our next presenter is Paul Woodward. He is the groundwater management engineer for the Papio, Missouri River Natural Resources District. He has worked at the district twice for a total of 12 years. Paul manages the district's groundwater management plan and regulations and oversees the Missouri River Levee Improvement Project south of Bellevue, Nebraska. Paul is a professional engineer, has a Bachelor of Science in Ag Engineering from the University of Nebraska in Lincoln, and he is a certified floodplain manager. Paul, we look forward to hearing from you.
Great. Good morning. Before we dive right into some of the concerns, I want to go over a brief background of our district. We are located 6 counties along the Missouri River down to their confluence with the Platte River in Nebraska. Includes the Omaha metropolitan area, so a large population area. We do maintain 85 miles of channels and levees. All of those are in the PL 8499 program, but specifically we have 48 miles of actually levied levees in those systems. Mainly the one I'm going to refer to today is the 19 miles at the confluence of the Platte and the Missouri River and the Papio down here. So basically, looking at that, we already have a lot to do. We do work in tandem with other agencies on flood risk, but maintaining these levees is a top priority. So as we dive into some of the concerns, most of these have already been spoken to or highlighted by the other speakers. I'm going to really focus in on how they apply to us and what some of our objections might be. So I'm going to talk about a little bit. Dan brought up the tie that they've sent out about the fact sheet between the 8499 program. Then talk about these additional levee sponsor responsibilities. How could they be detrimental, requiring us to do things that we don't already have authority for or we don't have time and money to do. And then what would using the risk assessment do in terms of maybe interfering with our regular O&M. Talk about our legal exposure and liability, and then really ask a big, broad question: why do we need this guidance right now? Kind of in my viewpoint, we haven't really worked on some of the risk assessment things we could have done, or emergency action planning we could have done. So that's all still out there, and the Corps could work with us right now on that without having spent all this time on a guidance document. So we've never seen the importance of the PL 8499 program more than we do right now. We had a just extremely massive flood last year in March, which I'm sure many of the people downstream recognize or were impacted by as well. Just to do the temporary repairs along some of our levees, we spent some around, worked with the Corps around 20 million. Some of those, part of that, some of those were 20% NRD. And we also had to provide borrow material. So there was a lot of investment just to get back to where we were. And then the project I'm managing right now is to completely improve and rebuild, which we were working on, 10 years before this flood ever happened, the levees down there along the Missouri and the Platte River. So that's been going on. I guess our issue here in the thought, so right now with the EC, it wouldn't change any of the eligibility criteria yet. You would still go back to the regular inspection checklist, and they would, but there would just be a yes or no on there as to whether you met that eligibility criteria or not. But as they point out in that fact sheet that Dan pointed to, this is teeing up future changes. So those 3 of those 4 other things, the sharing the information, the participation, are all very subjective. I mean, we could measure how we were doing on deficiencies to a levee. We can't measure, how well are you participating? So that's going to be an issue going forward. We talked quite a bit about what these additional responsibilities are, so I don't need to touch on too much of them. Dan brought forth this point, so they make this point. And so everything they've talked about in the CC, we feel is additional requirements. And they actually knock back some of their work a little bit, I feel, because they're going to inspections every 5 years. I think they're trying to balance it out, because if they don't have the time and money to do some of the stuff now, how are they going to have the time and money to, this being the Corps, prepare all those risk assessments for all the levees across the nation? That's a lot of effort and a lot of work. And then, so some of that then additionally gets shifted to the levee sponsor, preparing that risk awareness strategy with the Corps, doing response activities and mitigation. So we try and kind of ask ourselves, why are we trying to shift this responsibility? We think it could have, and we think that could have impacts kind of twofold. One, it would, we would still have to fill, that being our staff and our workers, would still have to fill some of that levee inspection maintenance gap, 5 years between checking on stuff. We'll be doing that more often, of course, to make sure everything is still up to speed. And then you add the time needed to spend on the risk assessment mitigation part. That's going to add a lot of effort and issues to that. And then, like you pointed out, most sponsors don't have the authority to be the middleman. We do feel that we need to communicate those things about our levee to local zoning areas, emergency managers, but and that can still get done, but it gets done working with many other agencies. It's not all tied into the Corps' program. So we feel that could really get confusing and interfere with other agencies as well. To highlight that, I brought forward one of the Corps' figures, which I really liked. So today, what currently happens is, we work with FEMA to set the flood hazard risk. The Corps is involved there too. We work with the standards for the 8499 program and provide O&M. And then really the local communities and FEMA zoning requirements take place within the levees. If those aren't quite, I know on many of the flood maps, those aren't quite right. So we need to go back and make sure that we've got interior drainage things handled, things like that, and then that they can use that information. So, that's missing in a lot of areas too. And that this risk assessment might help get to that, but we would already have authorities to work with FEMA and stuff like that on those. So what does the future hold? this is what I kind of see being haphazard is when the Corps in their presentation and their EC said, generally, the levy sponsor is the lead for most activities, but the Corps is available to support. Well, I don't think we can break up the duties that way. It's not going to be very effective. One of the things I think of is if the Corps technically prepared the levy or the risk assessment, a lot of us don't have all the staff and capability to take what was said in those and inform everybody on the landward side, or to prepare for the emergencies when they do happen. So moving on a little bit, the issues with risk assessment guiding our maintenance is that a lot of things could be overlooked. It could detract from our routine maintenance items. It will also likely affect funding and staff time needed. As we really dig in and are completely raising and improving our new levee system down there, right now going through the constructions, it is amazing the amount of small things that need to be addressed. And I just don't see that all getting taken care of if you're relying on a bigger risk assessment piece. Corinne touched mostly on exposure and liability. I think as these responsibilities get shifted and moved, it opens up levy sponsors to more exposure, but it also takes away, the Corps has that broad immunity afforded to them under the Act. So what good does it do to move from their immunity onto the local sponsors? That's just going to, one, increase our staff time and funding needed to handle legal issues. It's also going to potentially, I don't know of any right now that we don't have any legality issues going on right now at the levees, but it certainly wouldn't take long for the insurance companies to look at what's going on with our risk and decide that we need either higher premiums or maybe just unavailable to have coverage after this anyway. So there's potentially issues there. I think finally, kind of trying to wrap up here, what is the point of the new guidance? In one of the Corps safety reports, they said the point of the program, the purpose of the levee safety program, is assessing, managing, and communicating levee-related risk to people, property, and the environment. And I feel a large part of that should still be the Corps' responsibility to handle some of that, especially the technical information and helping communicate that information. So if we already have the authority to do some of these things, emergency action planning goes a long ways in working with the other stakeholders that are involved. So we could already be doing that and still not have to issue this new guidance or revise the 8499 program. So in summary, to kind of go through really what our major concerns are, not that there couldn't be more than this, but that the new fact sheet ties future eligibility changes to the 8499 program. That'll be very subjective. We don't have spare time and money for the new EC requirements. We can't defer maintenance issues because those, as we've seen, will build up over time. Most of this infrastructure is already old enough that, as we're improving what we have right now, just on that levee system, our other levee systems continually need upgrades too. Basically the upgrades get more and more the older it gets. We can't allow the legal shift of exposure and expense. Again, I think that'll blow up if insurance companies and stuff get a hold of that at times. And then what really is the purpose of the new EC guidance? They say combining some older guidance, it might help them out, the Corps out on some budgeting issues, but yeah, to really just assign new responsibilities to the local sponsors, to the levee districts, really isn't going to fit, I don't think. So that pretty much wraps up my comments.
Paul, thank you very much. Refreshing to hear on the ground perspective, and some of the comments that you pose fall in line with what the other speakers have said. Several have used the Q&A box. If you would also offer any thoughts and comments that we can share with other non-federal interests in that box, that's always helpful. As you know, we delivered a letter to USACE on this EC, and we will deliver another letter that compiles thoughts and non-federal interest perspectives on this this draft document. So we'll transition over, unless any of the speakers have additions. We'll transition over to some of the Q&As. And in looking through them, of course, Kyle, as usual, has answered all the ones related to him. Are there, Corinne, or, because you've had a little time to look at this, are there a few of these that you want to tackle at this time?
Oh, sure. I think I can answer all the questions that were presented to me with the simple response of, it depends. You know, these are very, you know, how risk assessments could be challenged, enforcement can be questioned, application of regulations. Those are, and how that may occur, whether through administrative or judicial review, really kind of depends on a lot of factors. So I would leave it at that, rather than kind of saying, you know, we can kind of set out a pathway at this time that would allow kind of challenging one or the entire aspect of the levee safety EC.
Yeah, thanks, Corinne. And we'll make sure everyone has a copy of our more detailed analysis of the EC and some of the concerns that we have. And we'll add any of the ones that are brought up in this Q&A session to our next letter. Dan, any thoughts from you?
I have all kinds of thoughts. Baseball season's about to crank out with no fans. Yeah, I was just trying to look at some of the questions, Stephen. There are some tough nuts there, and I've tried to answer 3 or 4. One recurring question, and I'm really going to beg for Corinne's help on this, is the linkage between the EC and accreditation under 44 CFR 6510. And I'm honestly having a hard time coming up with a concise answer to that. I do know that under Biggert-Waters 12, I don't know why I remember this, but section 100.226, Corinne and I spent some time on this a few weeks ago. There was a provision that superficially, twice I've used that word today, made a lot of sense. It had the Corps and FEMA get together to try to harmonize the manner in which they produce information as required by 6510 to, in the Corps' case, certify a levee or work with the non-federal sponsor to certify the levee, and then to work with FEMA to get accreditation. Before that provision was enacted and before the two agencies produced a report in 2013, it was a relatively straightforward standard whereby the Corps or the non-federal sponsor would provide certification that the project met FEMA's baseline standard, which of course is the 100-year standard. And typically, at that moment, FEMA would grant accreditation. That process in 2012, and then the agency MOU in 2013, I think it was, changed that in a dramatic way. And the core risk assessments, which look beyond the project to the floodplain, are now in play. And I will stop there because that's about the limit of my knowledge. Actually, I may have crossed that limit 2 minutes ago. Corinne, can you add to that or clean up?
Well, I'll try. And, you know, I hate to say, though, that, you know, we really don't have an answer right now, right? Especially as FEMA is looking at and thinking about risk rating 2.0. You know, it's long been a question for those in the levee policy space. How are levees going to be, and levee protected areas going to be treated under risk rating 2.0? And we don't have a certain answer, but it's been indicated that core risk assessments will be used. So how that manifests with certification and accreditation and risk rating 2.0 is the great unknown at this point, but something that certainly I think folks are rightly concerned and with, and you know, should, you know, it would be good to know better, you know, how those things are going to be linked together, either through risk rating 2.0 or prior to that, simply through, Dan, as you were saying, you know, the certification and accreditation process. You know, I would say lastly, I would say, you know, this is kind of harkens back to what I was saying in my presentation and my remarks about not having an opportunity to appeal, and what are some of the consequences of a bad risk assessment result? What might that mean? And if you get it, what can you do about it? These are why some of those procedural elements are important. Kind of as it's moved out with.
I mean,
go ahead.
Let's see if you agree with this statement. Make no mistake about it. The risk assessments, which are a very recent phenomenon, right? Past 10 years, are truly the focus, right? And at least for PL 99 and some other authorities, they are absolutely displacing something that a lot of people have griped about for generations, inspections. And whether or not a system is acceptable, minimally acceptable, or unacceptable. And I have thought for the past few or more months, be careful what you wish for. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Always be careful what you wish for. But no, other than that, and you know, I wouldn't say that I disagree. I would say kind of, I think Paul kind of in his presentation kind of spoke to this a little bit. This is these are big changes. This move to these risk assessments and how they're going to be used and what they're going to be used for and how this is going to be implemented. And if we're going to go down this path in some way, it should be with baby steps, because there's real consequences and real implications that aren't being given their due in how we're presently heading out.
Yeah, I mean, well said. You know, a good many of these proposed actions under the EC and this linkage with Levee accreditation are untried, right? Now, that in and of itself doesn't mean that they're problematic, but there are a lot of untried initiatives that are beginning to grow legs. Yes?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And
I think just from a practical example, we're going through the Levee accreditation on the project we're improving right now. Like I said, that's been in the works for over 10 years. And we had a massive flood. You're only one massive flood away from people questioning all of the data and the risk assessment and all of the data in your hazard, flood hazard issues. And then if you have an engineering company or somebody who's working to certify the levee, if a risk assessment was out there that was contradictory, they can't put their stamp on that. It's going to complicate things quite a bit. And, things are always changing. I know that. It's just hard to have all the stars aligned so that you can make it through some of these requirements.
All right. Thank you, Paul.
Yep.
indeed.
Thank you, guys. Anything else from our speakers this morning?
I would just say thank you all to joining us and for participating, for asking good questions and for your attention. We surely do appreciate it and hope that you've found it to be worth your while.
Dan?
I appreciate the opportunity to visit with folks and grateful for the interest. There was a very sizable crowd here from a wide variety of platforms, and it's a real privilege to get to visit about these things with so many people.
Yep. Thank you, Dan. Paul?
Yeah, we really appreciate the opportunity to be part of this, and hope he said some things that most other local sponsors can agree with. There are comments being prepared. Stephen, maybe you can touch on that. Just sharing ideas, things across the board there. But yeah, to get comments in by the deadline.
Yes.
Here.
Thank you, Paul. And we'll provide everyone a copy of our comments on the EC. We'll prepare another document to send in response to the draft EC by the 27th. We encourage you to do so. Use any of the information that's beneficial for you in our document. We'll send it in Word form. A PDF of the slides for the presentation that you just heard, each of them, is on this WebEx, but if you need it and you don't see it there or have trouble with it, email any of us and we'll send it to you. We'll send you a PDF copy of it. Thanks, Kyle, Dan, Corinne, Paul. Super job. I appreciate you doing the hard work that it takes to deliver this within an hour and a half, and we're at 1:23 now. Emily, thanks for all your work to pull this together. Anything we need to know before we sign off, Emily?
Hey, thank you, Stephen.
Yep. Appreciate you guys a lot. Thanks all who participated. Keep asking questions or submitting information on there. I've noticed a few people have submitted their opinion. That's good. This is a big program. And it's not just along mainline Mississippi. It's all over the country. And we need to make sure we do this right, because the people on the ground are the ones that will have to live with it, or have to live with getting it changed through Congress, which is very difficult. Once we've started down a road, it's hard to get Congress to turn the ship around. So thank you all for today. We're signing out here. We
Well,
appreciate you very much.
well, before we do that, Stephen, we have some poll questions
Okay.
at the end of the presentation that we would like to get to. If you could pull that slide up for us, Emily, and kind of put us
Yeah,
on that.
you're right. You're right. Thank you, Corinne.
Sure, yeah. So we have these 3 polling questions, and if you would take a moment to answer those, you can do so on your computer on the next slide. Emily, are you going to deliver those? There you go. And we'll all be able to see the results of what's submitted.
Yep. If you'll do that quickly, click on those quickly. Emily will go to the next slide, and they'll be tabulated, and it gives you a general view, and it is a requirement to get credits through our system.
Mm-hmm. And some of the continuing legal education credits require the use of poll questions as well. If that's your jurisdiction, you should know that. In any case, there's question 1. And Emily, you just want to flip over to question 2 before we look at the results? All right, well, hopefully this was an easy question for you and you've all taken a moment to answer it. We can flip over to the next question here pretty quickly. And then this is our final question. All right, as you think about that one and hopefully answer it pretty quickly, Emily, if you could flip to the slide 65 for us. So I just wanted to point out here the link for comment. We've talked about comment. There's the address there. So y'all have that. Comments are currently due July 27th. Some folks have requested an extension. Whether or not we're going to see that is unknown. So I would be encouraging everyone to spend the next few days working on their comments. And then I think response to our first question, we don't have that yet for our second or third question. We'll see when Emily shoots those to us, but let's go ahead with the response to the first question, Emily. All right. Well, I say
Okay.
that's good. You want to be our interpreter, Stephen? Go ahead.
Yeah, let's move on to the next. Good response on that. Thank you. Yeah. Okay. You can sort of see where people are falling on this. A good bit of unknown and not sure at this point still. And last one. Yep, very interesting results. Thank you for participating in this. And thank you for taking the time to participate in this call. We're at 1 minute, 29 and 25 seconds. And unless anybody has a closing remark, let's sign out.
Thanks, Stephen.
All right. Thank you. Thank you,
Thanks,
everyone.
everybody. Appreciate you very much.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.